Hi, today I will be doing a presentation for my social inequality class. The information that will be covered in this presentation mostly comes from this textbook, Social Inequality in a Global Age, 5th edition by Scott Cernoff, as well as other sources that I deemed appropriate for this discussion. The chapter that I chose to do my presentation on is Chapter 5, Racial and Ethnic Inequality. And due to the subject matter that we are discussing, I felt that it was appropriate to wear my number 7 Colin Kaepernick shirt. Shout out to Colin Kaepernick. In this presentation, I will be discussing the struggles faced by people of color because they are the groups that never became white, so to speak. The struggles faced by these groups and the situations and circumstances faced by these groups are entirely different from people who are termed as whites. A gentleman named Robert Blonner termed this process internal colonialism, and it has 4 basic elements. And I will read from the text these 4 basic elements as well as give my own commentary as to how these basic elements still apply to minorities in the United States today. Number 1 is control over a group's governance. The colonial group is allowed neither full autonomy nor full participation in the national government. You see today that there are very few minority government officials, and some people try to say that this does not apply to African Americans because we do have a black president. However, I beg to differ. There are laws put in place to criminalize African Americans, and in turn, they use these convictions as a basis to take away the voting rights of people convicted of these crimes, which in turn, again, a lot of these crimes target African Americans. So this is a way of preventing full participation in national government. Number 2 is restriction of freedom of movement. Colonial peoples are not willing immigrants, but are involuntarily incorporated into the national society. Often their ability to choose where they live and work is severely restricted. And we all know that this is the case to this day. There are people that refuse to rent to people of certain backgrounds. There are people who refuse to give jobs to people of certain backgrounds. I can go as far as to say that there are resumes thrown in the trash because the names may sound too ethnic. Number 3 is colonial style labor exploitation. A cultural division of labor exists in which the colonial peoples are assigned to the most menial or dangerous work and given the least compensation for that work. And we know that's true today. There are groups of people who are called for certain jobs simply because of the group that they belong to. Number 4, belief in a group's inferiority. In this model, prejudice follows from rather than causes discrimination. The exploitation of the colonial group must be justified, as this is done through an ideology that asserts the group's moral, intellectual, and cultural inferiority. Thus, the domination of the group's members by others is for their own good. And that is why, in most cases, religious missionary work is extremely dangerous, because this is what it's really all about. If you want to conquer a people, you go in and you tell them that their God is evil, that their beliefs are evil, that their religion is wrong. So that's the first step in conquering these people. But that's a story for another day. Another story for another day. I'd be here all day talking about that, so I have to get into the subject material. I would like to mention a part of Jesse Williams' quote that he gave at the BET Awards. It was highly controversial to those who don't want to hear the truth, but a sentence from that quote says, "And we're done watching and waiting while this invention called whiteness uses and abuses us." So as we go along in this presentation, we will talk about how whiteness is indeed an invention. So The first group talked about in our textbook is the Native Americans. The book mentions Columbus and his encounter with the Native Americans and how he talked about they were perfect candidates for subjugation. The book doesn't go on to say what all Columbus said, so I Googled the quote that he gave on this. The information comes from a website, rawstory.com, and the full quote is, "They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawks' bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." He also goes on to talk about how it's basically their Christian duty to ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy them. There's also a quote from one of his childhood friends who was also one of his men in these expeditions, and the man casually and nonchalantly talks about how he raped a Native American woman as if it was nothing. And again, Columbus is a person that we celebrate with a national holiday. I don't, but again. The textbook goes on to talk about how the native people of the Americans were thought of as savages, and they were treated or mistreated as such. Many of them were annihilated. Many of those who were not annihilated were forced to assimilate. Even so, that still wasn't good enough. Now I'm going to read something else directly from the textbook. Many native peoples did attempt to assimilate. By the time of Andrew Jackson's presidency, many of the Cherokee lived in villages with blacksmith shops and white steeple-top churches. They were farmers. Yet Jackson was determined that the Indians must go, and they were marched on the Trail of Tears to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. With few exceptions, the remaining native populations of the eastern United States were to be moved west of the Mississippi. A few remained in rugged pockets of New York and the Carolinas. A few resisted, such as the Seminoles, multiracial descendants of the Creek and escaped black slaves who held out in the Florida Everglades, but most were removed. Over the years, there continued to be this cycle, basically, of acceptance and non-acceptance, acceptance and non-acceptance. Fast forward to today. Most American Indians are now urban. 2/3 live in major metropolitan areas. Los Angeles is currently home to the single largest concentration of native peoples in the United States. Those who remain on reservations, especially isolated rural reservations, are the most likely to be poor. In the 2000 census, the single poorest county in the United States was not one containing urban slums, but Buffalo County, South Dakota, home to the Crow Creek Reservation. Unemployment among Native Americans on reservations has topped 30%, and poverty rates are over 60%. For those too isolated to benefit from a thriving casino and who have few exploitable resources, the choices are familiar. They can risk poverty for the autonomy and community of the reservation, or they can take their chances on assimilation in major urban areas and risk isolation, dislocation, and the vagaries of the urban economy. And this information is from page 124. I'd also like to mention something else that is touched on page 124. It says, meanwhile, interest in native spirituality, native ecology, and native crafts has mushroomed. The American Indian population is growing rapidly, less because of high birth rates than because of being Indian, it says in quotations, is now a matter of distinction, and many whites, it says in quotations, are reclaiming their partial native heritage. Descendants of interracial couples who once fought to be accepted as white are now eager to emphasize the red and its assumed nobility and wisdom. That made me think about something that I saw in the documentary Hidden Colors 2 when they talk about the dolls' roles. And here is Hidden Colors 2. The Dawes Rolls was basically a census to determine which Native American tribes would get certain land allotments and other benefits. White citizens were allowed to come in and pay under the table, money under the table, to be listed as part Native American in order to be able to reap some of these benefits. That explains why to this day, there are so many people walking around claiming to be Native American, claiming to be Indian, but they do not look like they have any Native blood in them at all. That is where a lot of that comes from. And it also makes me think of something that I saw a video on YouTube from Ancestry.com, where one of the questions that people ask is, how come when they get their DNA back, they don't have American Indian in their DNA? And the lady said that there are a lot of myths, family myths, that you have a great grandma or a great grandpa that was Indian, and that a lot of times it's just simply not true. And I believe that a lot of that comes from this that was mentioned in Hidden Colors 2. The next group discussed by our textbook is African Americans. I really think that our textbook sugarcoated a lot and left out a lot in regards to the history of African Americans. I would recommend that people, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to advertise, but I'm telling you where I got this information and where I believe is a good place to find this information. But if you really want a very good, thorough history course on Black Americans and Black people in the world in general, I would suggest that you pick up Hidden Colors 1, Hidden Colors 2, and Hidden Colors 3, as well as Hidden Colors 4. I've seen all 4 of them. I don't own Hidden Colors 4 yet. I will soon, but I do own Hidden Colors 1, 2, and 3. So with that being said, I'll go back to the material in the textbook. It says that perhaps the classic internal colonial group in the United States has been African Americans brought to this continent involuntarily. See how the book sugarcoats? Involuntarily should be by force in 1916. The textbook says that the slaves' movements were closely controlled, and even those who had escaped across the borders to free states were to be returned. Black slave labor filled the gap left by destruction and removal of the native population. African labor quickly became the preferred choice of cotton and tobacco plantation owners. To this day, African rhythms of life, work, and diversion still color the coast of the Americas from Maryland to the southern reaches of Brazil. As with the native population, the actions taken towards the African slaves were justified by stereotypes. The book touches on Thomas Jefferson, but in my opinion, this is something else that is sugarcoated. He owned slaves and even started sleeping with his slave Sally Hemings, who was underage. I want to say that I heard that she was about 12 at the time, but I don't have documentation at this time to back that up. But I believe that's about the age that she was. But the textbook says Thomas Jefferson included the promotion of slavery among the crimes of King George III in his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, but he was later persuaded to remove it. Jefferson knew that slavery was immoral, but was uncertain what to do about it. If he was so uncertain what to do about it, he would have done something in his own household. The textbook says that somewhere in the textbook, it said that he wanted to free the slaves, but he died before he was able to do so, or something like that, which, again, that's not true. If he wanted to do something about it, he could have started by not sleeping with underage Sally Hemings, impregnating her, and then in turn having his own children be slaves. But again, that's another story for another day. The textbook goes on to say, oh, here it is. It says Jefferson promised to free his own slaves as soon as he was out of debt. Unfortunately for them, he died still deeply in debt. Sugarcoating. Okay. It goes on to talk about Benjamin Franklin. He was president of an abolitionist society in Pennsylvania, but he also thought that Africans would need to be returned to Africa to leave the Americas for the lovely white and red. His assimilationist sentiments extended to native peoples, but not to Africans. That's why you have to watch some people who come around and claim they want to help, because as the textbook says, Benjamin Franklin was an abolitionist, but he obviously didn't think highly of Africans or their descendants. So sometimes people will claim to help just because they want to get you out of the way. They really don't see you as equals. The textbook also talks about how black free men were limited in the jobs they could hold and the positions to which they could aspire. It says the United States ended slavery in 1865 and Brazil followed in 1889, but long-established institutions changed slowly. In the southern United States, rural slaves simply became sharecroppers. They still worked for the landowners, but were now bound by debt obligations rather than formal slavery. In the North, employers used newly freed slaves as strike breakers, threatening to replace striking workers with blacks desperate for any work. The pattern of internal colonialism remained in place. Segregation controlled African Americans' movements. Wage and job discrimination continued their labor exploitation. Voting rights limited their self-government, and stereotypes about them persisted. It also says persistent segregation means that many blacks are concentrated in central city areas where there are few jobs available to them, and that is talking about, modern times today. And again, the textbook really did not go into in depth in African American history. And again, I would recommend the documentaries Hidden Colors 1, 2, 3, and 4 for in-depth information and a in-depth history course on that. The next group that we will discuss is Hispanic Americans. Our textbook breaks Hispanic Americans down into the following 4 categories: Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and the last category, it says Haitians and Dominicans and those from Central and South America. I've never heard before reading this that everyone classified as people from the Caribbean are as being classified Hispanic Americans, but it's in the textbook, so we're just gonna roll with it for this assignment. The textbook talks about, first it talks about Mexican Americans. It talks about in 1836, Anglo settlers from the southeastern United States fought alongside disgruntled Tianos or Spanish-speaking Texans to wrest Texas from newly independent Mexico. It says that the Anglos dominated. 10 years later, Texas joined the United States as a slave state. A border dispute resulted that led to the Mexican-American War. The 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ending the war, gave fully half of the Mexican territory to the United States, land that is now California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and much of Colorado. And as had happened in Texas, residents of Spanish heritage, some whose families had lived in this territory since the 1500s, lost land and political influence, and many became poor laborers. The new Mexican Americans contributed a great deal to culture and the economy of this region, yet they came to be viewed with suspicion as outsiders in an Anglo-dominated Southwest. Workers with mining experience from north central Mexico brought important skills that bolstered the California gold rush and later mining in Nevada and Colorado. It says that Mexican workers brought the skills, clothes, and techniques that would become the symbols of the American cowboy. And is it just me, or is this cultural appropriation a reoccurring theme? Taking things from different groups and then throwing the people away. I mean, it's one thing to pay homage or tribute to a culture, but to completely hijack elements from the culture and then throw the people away, that's something that's not cool. And it goes on to say that these Mexican Americans were poorly paid, they provided the colonial labor, and they were quickly excluded from governing coalitions. They were stereotyped. It talks about during the Great Depression before the Great Depression, it talks about around 1917, they were needed as agricultural workers, so we welcomed them here. Then during the Great Depression, we sent them back, and it was basically like the Native Americans, acceptance, unacceptance, bring you over, send you back type thing. It talks about Cesar Chavez, and there's a really good movie about him that recently came out that I watched with my brother and my son over the Christmas holidays. But it talks about how he led union stage strikes against the owners of California vineyards to protest poor wages and working conditions. It talks about how in recent years a strong anti-immigrant sentiment has again prevailed in California. Just turn on the news. We have an openly racist Republican presidential nominee who says vile and just horrible things about Mexican Americans on a regular basis, as well as other groups, African Americans. Like I said, he's openly racist and he says openly racist things. The book goes on to talk about Puerto Ricans, the creation, and Cubans. It says the creation of two other Latino groups in the United States, Cuban Americans and Puerto Ricans, is directly tied to U.S. colonial expansion at the end of the 19th century. The Spanish-American War of 1898 gave the United States control of the Philippines and the island of Puerto Rico, as well as protection of the newly independent country of Cuba. The Philippines ended up gaining their independence, but the Puerto Rico became a territory of the United States. There was also a Puerto Rican independence movement that sparked. So it says that they now elect their own island government and have no official representation in the U.S. Congress. And forgive me, I continue to look at the timer because I'm running short on time, but I'm only halfway through my presentation. So I hope that, hope this all goes well, but please forgive my pauses and my mispronunciations. Again, I'm a little bit nervous too. It goes on to say that during much of this time, many Puerto Ricans have moved from the island to urban areas in the United States in hopes of employment, most significantly to the New York area, but also to Chicago and other major metropolitan regions. Because Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, they do not face immigration limits in coming to the U.S. mainland. Many have experienced poverty and dislocation, however, as they have shuttled between the island and the mainland. It says, but both on the island and on the mainland, they remain the poorest Latino group. It says that they are a group often caught between two worlds. Many Puerto Ricans have considerable African heritage and so face the particular burden of stigma and discrimination on the mainland here in the U.S. On the island, they may consider themselves to be tan, but in the United States, they become black. Also with this, they have the highest degree of segregation of any Latino group. This description reminds me of a book I read entitled Random Family by Adrienne LeBlanc. My brother actually gave it to me as a Christmas gift a couple of years ago. The book follows the lives of a Puerto Rican family in the Bronx, and I believe it's like the 80s, 90s era. And this is actually the book Random Family, and it's a must read. It's a must read for anyone who is in the sociology field. Let's see. The book goes on to talk about Cuban Americans. It says their experience is far more mixed. Given the close proximity and close ties of the two countries, a handful of Cubans moved regularly between the United States and Cuba before Fidel Castro's rise to power in 1959. It says that once Castro made his break in ties with the U.S., he declared himself a communist, and many middle-class Cubans fled for the United States. They were refugees, but refugees who arrived with more money and education than many. They also found in the United States a sympathetic government that shared their anti-Castro sentiments. Travel from Cuba became difficult until a brief period in 1980 when Castro opened the port of Mariel. The group that fled Cuba during this time were more likely to come by boat than by plane, and they were poorer and less elite. In the United States, there was a rumor that Castro was emptying his prison and asylums. And it says, yet these newcomers seem to have no more criminal tendencies than any other. They were, however, more likely to be working class and less likely to be classified as white than the earlier arrivals. This actually reminded me of the scene on the movie Scarface where Michelle Pfeiffer's character Elvira asked Al Pacino's character Tony if he was a member of the Cuban crime wave. It's really neither here nor there, but I like to mention pop culture references as they help people to, find relevance in the information sometimes. But it was when they were in the dance club and Michelle was with her boyfriend or husband or whatever he was, and she was dancing with Tony, and she made that remark about him being a part of the Cuban crime wave. And also to this day, there's a large Cuban presence in Miami. And again, like I said, that was a stereotype. Like the textbook said, there were, however, more likely to be working class, and they basically had no more criminal tendencies than anybody else. It mentions other Latino newcomers facing mixed receptions. It mentions Haitians and Dominicans, about them being black. So, of course, they get stereotyped and discriminated against for that. It mentions refugees from Central America and Nicaragua. And just basically how groups who come from some countries are welcomed in, like it says Guatemalans and Cubans had, middle-class exiles from Nicaragua were fleeing a socialist government, so the United States were welcoming them in, whereas it says less welcome were Salvadorians and Guatemalans, sometimes refugees from peasant groups targeted by right-wing governments and death squads using U.S. supplied arms and tactics. So it went against the political ideology of the United States to welcome them in at that time. It talks about Irish Americans and new European groups. It says that the Irish in particular had been on the poor fringes of the United Kingdom for a long time and were treated as an internal colony in Britain. They fled famine and disruption on their island to find opportunity in the United States. And basically when they got over here, they found that they were treated the same way. They got the same reception. However, the Irish eventually became white. The textbook says, and I quote, "How did the Irish Americans overcome their disadvantaged positions? They became white." And that reminds me of another book. It's called How the Irish Became White by Noel, and I cannot pronounce his last name, but it talks about how the Irish came to America in the 18th century, fleeing a homeland under foreign occupation and a caste system that regarded them as the lowest form of humanity. In a new country, a land of opportunity, they found a very different form of social hierarchy, one that was based on the color of a person's skin. So again, this talks about how the Irish became white. New groups came in, such as the Italians, and they initially faced segregation as well, but again, they became white. The textbook talks about how draftees from all of these new European groups fought together during World War I, while blacks and Latinos were still segregated. So when these other European groups fought together, they came home from the war. The GI Bill and the Veterans Administration invited them to attend the same colleges and to borrow for homes in the same growing suburbs. European Americans had become white. Left behind in urban areas and emphatically not welcome in the suburbs were the remaining groups, blacks and Latinos. The textbook goes on to talk about middlemen, minorities, and ethnic solidarity. And I think I'm going to have to stop here because I think YouTube has a limit on how much you can put on there. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to pick up, and I think I'm going to have to upload 2 different videos. So I hope that it's okay with my instructor. I'm very sorry that I've gone over by so much, but again, I'm going to pick up in a second video. Thank you.